Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. We're going to get started. I'm Mariah Besharov. I'm Professor of Organizations and Impact at Said Business School and also a fellow at Kellogg College here at the University of Oxford. And I'm really delighted to welcome those of you here in person and also those of you joining online to today's Insights for Action seminar. This is a seminar series that explores how researchers and practitioners within and beyond Oxford are using research insights to drive positive social change. And today we're really excited to be picking up on a conversation that we've had over the past few years on impact measurement. Sorry.
I heard on
Oh dear. I was trying to give us a little space to have the conversation, but I see that that's not the problem. Okay. How'd that get better? Okay. So we're going to be talking about impact measurement and in particular about meaningful impact measurement. And we've had several conversations about impact measurement and meaningful impact measurement with some of these same folks who are up here today over the past few years. But today we're really focusing in on what does meaningful measurement look like in the era of AI. And what we're starting to see is how AI is really showing the potential, certainly to fundamentally transform impact measurement in terms of efficiency in analysis and reporting. And the question that we're going to look at today and that the panelists have really been digging into in their own work is really around how might AI enable, but perhaps also constrain and challenge the focus on making impact measurement meaningful for the individuals who are at the heart of doing social impact work. And so this is a conversation that's going to build on a playbook that we released in partnership with the old fire station about a year ago, the Meaningful Measurement Playbook, which called out some core principles about how to do impact measurement in a way that is meaningful, emphasizing, and I think you've got these, something related to this on your seats. What we really emphasized in the playbook was the importance of doing measurement in a way that's non-reductive, that's inclusive, non-extractive, and empowering. And AI, in many ways, is challenging this or certainly reshaping it. And so we're going to dig into what that looks like and how AI can potentially also facilitate more meaningful impact measurement. And so I'm joined in this conversation by three experts, true experts in AI and impact measurement. And so I'll just briefly introduce them and then we'll get into the conversation. And I should say we'll talk for maybe 30 minutes or so and then we'll open it up for questions from those of you here in the room and also those of you joining online. So if you are joining online, please do pop questions into the chat as we go along. Okay, so Sarah Cassidy, first, is the head of inclusion and learning at the old Fire Station Arts Center in Oxford, and she is one of the co-authors of the Meaningful Measurement Playbook. And she works in her role at the old fire station on a variety of areas: community engagement, place-based change, and most relevant for today's conversation on meaningful measurement, both within the organization at the old fire station, but also in the old fire station work with partners across Oxfordshire, bringing organizations together to test and develop more human-centered approaches to measurement and to share the learnings from that work across the partnership and also more broadly in the social impact field. So welcome, Sarah. And then I'm also joined by Dr. Karim Harji, who works with individuals and organizations to strengthen how they finance, measure, and improve their social impact. He has a variety of roles in the university and beyond. I'll just mention the key ones within the university. He leads at Said Business School our impact measurement program, which really helps people navigate the complexity of measuring and managing impact. And he also teaches on our programs in impact investing and innovations in impact finance. And he's a fellow of the Skoll Center for Social Entrepreneurship. And we're thrilled to have you here as well. And then finally, Dr. Nick Andreu. Nick has worked in the impact space for over 15 years across academia, startups, investing, and consulting. And in his current role, he leads AI at Better Society Capital. And so really is working right at the heart of AI and impact measurement. Nick is an alum of Said Business School and is currently a visiting fellow with us at the Skoll Center. So welcome, Nick. Okay, so let's get into the conversation. Sarah, I want to start with you. but actually, sorry, before I do, I want to start with all of you. Those of you here in the room, and I think we could probably do like a thumbs up, thumbs down online as well. I just want to get a sense of how familiar you are with the idea of meaningful measurement. Raise your hand if you've read or heard about the ideas in the Meaningful Measurement Playbook. Okay, some. Okay, and even if you haven't read the playbook, is anyone sort of heard of the notion of meaningful measurement or making measurement meaningful? Maybe a few. Okay. And is anyone using this approach in their work? Okay, great. Okay, now let's check in on AI. I just want to get a sense of your sort of current views of AI. If you're optimistic about its potential, raise your hand. Okay, some partial hand there. And if you're skeptical, raise your hand. Okay, I like this. I study paradox, tensions, contradictions. I saw lots of hands go up twice. Yes, we're going to dig into that. And if you think, raise your hand if you think AI can be empowering in your work. Okay. And raise your hand if you think it may be extractive in your work. Okay, great. Okay, we have a lot to work with here. Okay, so with that context, now I'm going to turn to you, Sarah. So the old fire station is really a thought leader in for your work on meaningful measurement. And obviously some people in the room know what that is, but many are less familiar with it. So if you could just start by explaining, what do you mean at Old Fire Station by meaningful measurement, and what are the core principles that underpin the approach?
Sure. So for those of you that don't know us, we're first and foremost an arts centre. We're based in Oxford, and we share a building with the homeless charity Crisis, and that really shapes a lot of the work that we do. I know for the past kind of 7 years or so, we've been very preoccupied with this question of like what is meaningful measurement, and what needs to shift in order for partners to be able to embrace it and measure in more meaningful ways. And we kind of arrived at that from a place, first and foremost, of frustration. So feeling really frustrated with more conventional approaches to measurement, that, often we find ourselves collecting data. We didn't tell us anything meaningful about the work, that kind of was kind of reductive of what we did, and doing it in ways that kind of undermine the relationships we were building with people. And we knew that wasn't okay, because, fundamentally, what we measure really matters. It shapes where we place value. It shapes whose voice, informs the decisions we're making. And if the ways that we measure aren't meaningful, then the work that we're doing, it won't be meaningful either. So we knew something needed to shift, and that was kind of what led us to an approach called storytelling. Which is inspired by a technique called the most significant change. And in essence, it involves identifying people from across, an area of work that you want to learn about that reflects a breadth of different experiences. And those individuals meeting with trained story collectors to have a reflective conversation about their experience and what it meant for them in their own voice and words. We then kind of transcribe and edit those stories into 1 to 2 pages that capture the key things they said, but in their own voice and words, and then bring people together to discuss those stories and think about what we can learn from them. And I guess for us, that was kind of the first time we encountered measurement that felt meaningful, and took us on this path, along with Skoll and others, to think a bit more deeply about, well, what are the kind of principles and the qualities that therefore underpin what meaningful looks like. And for us, storytelling, it really shifted things. First of all, it enabled us to center the voices of those that are at the center of the work. So rather than having predetermined outcomes, it kind of encouraged us to think about what does change look and feel like when we start the conversation by asking people those questions. It was kind of it helped us arrive at learning that was really rich and deep and complex and human, and through a process that supported dialogue and brought people together from across different parts of the sector. And it also it's sorry, I've lost my trail of thought. It was a meaningful process in and of itself. Sorry, so it enabled people to it helped us to listen better. It helped us to learn better. It helped us to collaborate. It kind of, as an organisation, enabled us to kind of enrich what we were doing. So it shifted evaluation from this thing at the end to being something that was the work. It made us better at what we did. So that was kind of our experience of measurement, and that I think that really chimes with a lot of these principles that kind of underpin the playbook. So the first one kind of being around treat learning as a central purpose of measurement. So, rather than it being something that's driven by funding requirements, being centered around, what we want to learn, being about improving rather than improving. It's also about putting the people closest to the work at the center of the measurement process, kind of as I've described as storytelling. So being less about predetermined outcomes, but people telling us what matters to them. It's about engaging in open communication, bringing people together from across a network, including funders, to kind of decipher this learning and bring a plurality of voices into how we determine what's meaningful and impact. And it's about really trying to embed learning into the culture of organizations. And these are kind of then underpinned by 4 kind of characteristics, which are that, in order for measurement to do this and be meaningful, first of all, it has to be non-reductive. So it has to embrace complexity and try and kind of eliminate, reductiveness. It needs to be inclusive, so to centre the voices of those closest to the work. It needs to be non-extractive, so that it, isn't something that happens to people, but is kind of mutually beneficial and voluntary. And then it needs to be empowering, so it needs to kind of give voice to a full range of different perspectives. So it's a long answer, but yeah, that's kind of measurement and how I think it's kind of encapsulated in the playbook.
Okay, great. So I have one follow-up question for you, and I know we've talked about this as we wrote the playbook, but I have to ask it because I think it's really important for a broader group of people to hear, which is about, when you do meaningful measurement in practice, I think one of the concerns that is often raised around measurement is, well, where it, great, we hear the sort of narratives, we're centering the voices and experience of people closest to the work, but where is the accountability? And so can you just share a little bit from your experience doing meaningful measurement in practice, how, in fact, because this is what we talk about in the playbook, that how does it actually, by fostering learning, create accountability so that they're not really opposed, but they can go together?
Yeah, I think by involving people in that process, it kind of gives people, it kind of comes back to that thing around it being a meaningful process in and of itself. So you become accountable not just to the funders that are determining the outcomes for the work, but you're also accountable to the people that you're working with, and thinking about how, what you're measuring and, the way you're measuring can be centered around learning that is kind of driven by criteria set by those people or set by the work in itself, and thinking about how do we make sure that is at the heart of what we're doing.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, Corinne, turning to you. So, we've heard about what meaningful measurement is and what it looks like at the old fire station. You're working across sort of the field, if you will, of impact measurement and management. And so how do you see from that sort of field level perspective the value of meaningful measurement, and what does this approach add to impact measurement practices?
Thanks, Mara. So as you were saying, I work for or with a range of different groups. So some of those include the kinds of organizations that Sarah you described, like in the context of your work. And that's very local, it's very specific, could be nonprofits, charities, funded by philanthropy or government. At the other end of the spectrum, you have investors that are making these investments in organizations and seeking a financial return, but also some kind of impact, so social environmental impact. They operate in a very different paradigm, I think, than how we look at it in the nonprofit and charitable world. And unsurprisingly, there's a kind of demand for numbers. If we look at quantification of impact, that's really important. So everything from having lots of indicators and key performance indicators, metrics, etc., but also monetizing your impact and thinking about how you can almost reduce it to a comparable number in terms of a unit of impact. So we had this talk about a year ago on both the kind of perils and kind of opportunity around impact monetization. So it's a very different context. And I think why that's important is because sometimes when you're in the investment side of things, you're often investing through intermediaries. So the chain between the owner of capital and how they then deploy their capital into funds or other organizations, and then into the kind of frontline organization, and then to the person or group that will benefit, it's a very long chain. And so one of the principles around proximity to change is effectively not present in that world. You are multiple layers removed. And so you're trying to still understand what's the end kind of outcomes or impact in that chain. If you're providing capital, it flows through multiple intermediaries. And then the big question is, how do you take credit for what parts of impact? What are some of the kinds of questions around what gets measured and by whom, and who holds accountability for all of that impact? So it's a very different almost set of questions. And I think meaningful measurement, elevates the who question, as Sarah pointed out very well, because it says, let's not forget why we're doing this. Let's not forget who is implicated with these changes. And let's try and bring that more front and center in all of our work. And that's important because I think the default is almost a reductivist approach, which if you're in finance or investment, that's just how you work. And that's not a critique, it's a fact. That you want things that are comparable, you want to be able to simplify some of that complexity, and at least some of the elements might be in tension with the ones that you've described, Sarah. I think where I sit, there are a lot of investors that are looking for coexistence. They understand that numbers matter, but also the stories matter. They understand that there's a lot of nuance around how to interpret impact data if you're so far removed from that impact. And they situate their own role around what impact is in perhaps different ways than kind of frontline impact. So meaningful measurement, I think, offers an opportunity to say, what does context look like? When we talk about change, reaching 10,000 people, what does that really say? And how would different people interpret that number? And depending on what kind of position you hold in the organization, in the investment chain, you might have a very different interpretation of, is that a big number? Is that a small number? Shall we be reaching 10,000, 100,000 people? Or am I more concerned about changing the lives of 10 people over a 2-year period from where they started? And I think there's a spectrum of kind of interventions and ways to think about how you measure. And I think what meaningful measurement offers is the ability to make sure that we're not forgetting about this is all about people's lives. And sometimes when you're working with larger numbers and the kind of almost temptation to add it all up and aggregate it, I do think you lose some of that. The flip side is that a lot of us are working quite hard, I think, to try and find the right balancing act. And so it's not often an either or, it's what combination works in your context and what do we think is good enough to be able to truly tell the story in ways that actually are both effective and efficient.
Okay, thank you. And just, I would add a reflection or maybe a sort of a question as a follow-on, which is, there are, just sort of finding the balance, these things can be in tension, but there are some innovations bubbling around out there that do sort of what I might say is sort of a quantitative approach to meaningful measurement, right? And you and I have written about 360 decibels, which is, I think, a good example of this. And so, there, just reflect a little bit on that, maybe a sort of, is it really always in tension?
I think this is where, we're trying to move to this almost next generation of saying, well, with technology, and we'll get into AI in a minute, that things are possible now at a scale and price point that they just weren't before. So 60 decibels is a really great example of the idea that you can still ask people, what has changed in your life? Have them describe it, but also try and find ways to standardize that information across hundreds of thousands of people while not reducing the context, or at least not eliminating the context. In practice, that means using technology. It means doing benchmarking in a whole different way. In conventional benchmarking is you pick a set of common indicators, you try and compare them, and you hope that everything is standardized. This is almost a bottom-up set of benchmarks, where we might say it's very rich. It captures the lived experience of people in their different kinds of organizations, in different regions, different types of service contexts. And it says, why don't we compare on that basis? So instead of asking, how many people did we reach? We want to ask people, as a result of, let's say, the loan that you now have, or the new educational kind of intervention in your city, do you feel better off? Are you better off? And what are your prospects for the future? You can begin to embed qualitative texture and do that at scale and have alternative benchmarks so that you're not just counting how many people you reach, You're not just assessing, for example, an improvement in a test score. You're really then asking around nuance. What would it take to improve that for you and your family in terms of your kind of household outcomes over time? And that I think has been only recently possible in ways that we dreamed of like 10 years ago. And so it's a combination of both technology, not losing the kinds of important questions, and I think still centering people and the changes that they're going through in how they describe it. So it probably isn't the kind of classic either or that it was positioned as almost 10 years ago. I think now it's an and question rather than a or question.
Okay, thank you. And so that brings us to Nick and AI as sort of the major technological innovation that we're grappling with. And as I said when I introduced you, you're really working at the intersection, right, of AI and impact measurement in your role at Better Society Capital. And certainly when we wrote the Meaningful Measurement Playbook, I mean, we were obviously thinking about AI like everyone was, but we didn't feed that into the playbook explicitly or directly. And now, of course, there's no ignoring it, right? It's clearly transforming all of our worlds, and for today's conversation, most relevantly, the field of impact measurement and management. So reflecting on the playbook and the principles that Sarah talked about, just share a little bit about how you think about AI in relation to impact measurement and the efforts like the playbook to make impact measurement more meaningful.
Great, thank you. And this is a very topical question. I get asked about it basically every day from someone in the team. So I'm very glad that we're having this discussion. So if the question is, can AI contribute to meaningful measurement? The answer has to be yes. I mean, it's an incredibly powerful technology, probably one of the most powerful technologies that we've ever created. And it's so general purpose. It can do so many things. So to me, it's almost like we have to start from a yes. And the question then is how? How do we make it contribute to meaningful measurement? And I just thought I'd share a couple examples of what I've been seeing, one sort of out of the world, one that we've been developing in-house, just to give a flavor of how this might be possible and how it can relate to some sort of principles that we think are so important for measurement. And I should also say, so I'm leading the AI efforts now, but previously I worked in the investment team at BSC and previously ran an impact team at a social enterprise in East Africa. So sort of very much trying to bring all these things together to get that balance rather than the tension. So the first example I'll share is an academic team at a German university. They're building a tool to basically be the next generation of survey tools. So you design it as a survey, you sort of list out your questions, the flow, all that kind of thing. But AI is embedded throughout the whole thing. So if somebody wants to speak in answering these questions, they can do that. And then you can have a voice conversation. If you want to type, you can do that. It accepts lots of modalities. So already this brings more people into the measurement thing than a survey would just off the bat, right? Also, the fact that it's AI instead of someone having to call you and have a conversation means you can do it at whatever time you want, which again is more inclusive than just doing it kind of 9 to 5. But the thing that's really interesting about this is you give it the things that you want to learn, and then it adapts as it's speaking to that individual. So if they say something that's really interesting that it wants to follow up on, it will then do that. And so you get this much richer, deeper context of how they are answering the question that you wouldn't get with a survey. And so the way this looks is you're getting the profile of distribution, that's a survey, and the costs associated with that. Right? You send out a link. Of course, there's some kind of AI cost that you have to pay the thing that's doing the talking. But it has the richness of interviews, focus groups, and all that kind of stuff. So there's a group of us that have been kind of feeding in to the development of this thing. They're going to do a demo, I think, at the end of July, and then hopefully launch it. And then we can talk about it and show the world and so on. But I think this is a really exciting development that helps to bring some of that, the plurality of voices and so on into measurement. It also gets around this issue of it's not top-down driven in terms of what we want to know is what you're going to tell us. It also gives the opportunity for them to feed in a way that isn't the anything else you want to tell us box at the bottom of a survey, right? So anyway, we're very excited to see how that lands. The second example that I'll talk about is something we've been working on in-house, and it started from this idea that there's so much information on the web that previously we would have never considered impact information because it was so disorganized, so unstructured, so spread everywhere that it wasn't worth the time to try to organize that. But with AI, you can do that now. And so we've created a thing that will go on review websites and it will pull all the reviews into a Excel file, and then you can put that in your ChatGPT or Claude and you can query that data. And so what that enables us to do is we can do the whole take qualitative information and then turn it into a number for whoever wants the number. But it also allows us to see so many things that we wouldn't have seen otherwise in the voice of the people that have used these products. So just a couple of examples where we learned something that we didn't know before. There's a company in our portfolio called Second Nature. They are a diabetes prevention company. They do that through behavioral change. So it's like it is second nature to sort of lose and manage your weight. That's the concept. And we've always treated them as a physical health company because they do diabetes stuff. And it's been in the portfolio for 6-7 years, and that's always how we've thought about it. We did this exercise, and then we tallied the themes that were emerging from the reviews, and 30% of the reviews had something about mental well-being. They were more confident in themselves, higher self-esteem, less worried about stuff, and so on and so forth. So now that is changing how we think about this company. It is not only a physical health company, but also a mental well-being company, right? So bringing new insights, very low cost. It takes about 2 minutes to run this exercise. The second example I'll give is a company called Jude. So they make supplements for bladder control. And you can kind of intuitively see how that is helpful and impactful for people. But as we were reading the reviews, we couldn't believe how transformative it was for people. So I'm gonna read you this one that made the team kind of chuckle when we came across it. So the title of the review is Life-Changing, and it says, life-changing. I have struggled for years with an overreactive bladder, affecting holidays and events. My husband says he spent most of our married life, 40 years, waiting for me outside of the toilet. Jude has changed this, and now I travel carefree. And so that's a much richer picture, right, than has this product benefited you in some way and so on, right? So you can get all of this complexity and richness. You can turn it into numbers if you want. You can interrogate the stories if you want. And it's all much easier and sort of much cheaper. And so that's where we get excited about AI's potential to contribute to meaningful measurement.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm going to come back on the challenges, but first I want to just ask Sarah and Karim to reflect on, in your own work, how are you seeing similar kinds of opportunities as Nick described, or something different?
Yeah, I think, Nick, what you were saying also around being able to work with large amounts of data and bring those together, triangulation in the kind of term that we use, to spot patterns, to think about what's underneath the kind of first or second order messages. I think that's been incredibly powerful. And I think for any of us who are working data analysis, it's just a game changer. For data collection, it's interesting because I think it does allow you to be more creative around data collection. I think, even with this like adaptive surveys, you can certainly shorten the time between collecting data, analyzing it, and then using it to make a decision. So the feedback loop, I think, has been, quite shortened. And for a lot of investors, a lot of what they do is annual reporting. So the gap between collecting data, analyzing it, and putting it out into the world, often that last part, the translation into an external report, understandably takes a lot of work, because not only do you work through it internally, to go through multiple levels of review, and then there's always like accuracy and fact checking. And if you're ready impact reports, you might be able to, scroll in on different parts and just be like, what does that really say? And is that really meaningful? Or where did that come from? Or how do I know it's true? I think not too far into the future, we're already going to see impact reports that will be able to trace any claim all the way back to source data. You'll be able to triangulate that and kind of validate that independently. And you'll be able to call out what a lot of is happening already, whether you call it greenwashing or impact washing, where claims are made in an exaggerated fashion. Right now, you don't really know unless somebody gets called out or there's a headline that says, this company inflated the number of people that they say they're serving or helping or changing lives is the kind of tagline. Are you really changing someone's life? And again, in the not too distant future, we're already beginning to see more standardized impact reporting, standardized analysis, collection, and interpretation. And so anytime someone makes a claim, imagine being able to click on it and say, where did that come from? Do I believe it? And show me an example of a person who actually can back that up in the way that Nick you just described. So I find that really powerful, because for a lot of the time it's been a black box. And if we open up that black box, it's going to be really exciting. And for a lot of companies, it's going to be terrifying, because the gap between what they say and what they do might be quite high. There's also a whole regulatory aspect that we can get into later, because sometimes this gets pushed in positive ways by regulation and then pulled back in negative ways by regulation. So there's, I think, some of that is still underway at the moment. And I think I also get really excited because today, when you're doing impact measurement, the conventional approach has often been you spend a lot of time designing, collecting data, analyzing it. And by the time you get to the reporting phase, you effectively spent 80% of your time in your budget. Now you could kind of flip that. Maybe not 20%, but certainly you can get it down to 50% of your time and effort spent on the most tedious parts of the work. And then 50% thinking about, well, what do I do with this? What is it really telling me? And how do I bring it to life in the decisions I make? And for me, that's transformative. And I can say for like myself, I can say probably for you, Nick, and for other colleagues, we're already seeing that shift. And that has come much quicker than we had probably anticipated.
Thank you. And I mean, I think I'd say that we are kind of treading more tentatively in terms of our introduction of AI into kind of our measurement side of things. And I feel really inspired to hear about all those different, ways that you can, bring data to light that could sit alongside some of that, like even storytelling, qualitative work. I guess the main thing we've been thinking about is kind of, building on what Karun was saying as well. What role can AI play in kind of helping to accelerate the kind of the admin, the kind of summarizing around the edges that enables you to make the space to then engage more deeply with the data that you do have. So very much trying to make sure that we're not just proliferating lots of summaries that we're not supposed to engage with, but instead, how can it speed things up so that we can then go deeper on the things that feel really meaningful for us to engage with.
Okay, thank you. So, I mean, that was quite an optimistic picture. I know you said you're treading carefully, but you're clearly engaging, right? And trying to use it in a way that sort of augments the capacity of the team, right, at the fire station. And yet, I know, because I saw your hands go up when I said who's skeptical, you also had your hands up in some fashion, or that it could be extractive in some ways. So I want to dig into that a little bit and just ask you each to reflect on some of the challenges or sort of potential pitfalls or dangers as we wade into this or jump or dive into this space of AI in the service of impact measurement, and how we might be thoughtful, maybe more importantly, in addressing them through the kinds of design choices we make as we build AI capabilities, as we build agents and so on.
Okay. So I'll quickly run through my list because I think there's some things that AI could do probably even better than humans. Some things that maybe there's a combination, and some things that only people should be doing, or at least for now. So I think I've talked about what AI can do: process large volumes of data, triangulate and connect different kinds of data, compress this analytical work that often can take weeks and sometimes months. We're now seeing it in terms of days and occasionally hours, but it still sometimes takes a lot of time. It can also help with measurement design, because often when you're building something out at the front end, there's a lot of variables. You don't really know the context. And so thinking about the ways in which you might design in alternative scenarios, if you have more or less budget, if you have challenges collecting certain kinds of data or reaching a certain population. And then there's just optimization kind of benefits around aggregating large volumes of information historically and thinking about what does it tell you for your forward looking. Sometimes that's helpful. Occasionally that's not, because your context has changed, but I think there's a lot to be gained from that. I think where AI can complement, so you need humans to be kind of squarely alongside, is in sense making. Often we collect a lot more data than we use, and how you can use AI technologies to be able to surface patterns, themes, outliers, but also just think about like what stories you want to bring out. What are the most powerful ones? You can use technologies to be able to sift through some of those, but you do need, I think, humans to be able to unpack, like the one you said, like the one, if something like that is really what stood out, would Claude be able to pick the same one out as an example?
Sadly not.
Yeah, this is, I think we're still in this kind of middle phase of selective interpretation of things. So sense making, I think, is a big part of how you collect a story, how you think about what it means, and then how you think about what you do with it. You can't just automate that away. Stakeholder engagement, a lot of the work that you do day to day in terms of just setting up, thinking about who should be in the room, how to facilitate a conversation. What if something particularly profound, powerful, or even something that's quite, challenging or frustrating comes up? How do you react? That requires a human skill that I don't think we could simply type in a prompt and say, this person said this, how do I react? In the moment, you're not going to get the kind of response that you would need in that kind of setting, for example, that you work in. And then scenario building is a really powerful one, where you just think about, okay, if I'm learning these new kind of insights around whether my product or service is succeeding in what it says it's doing or failing, what could go wrong, what could go right, how do I respond, what are the ways in which I can use this information to make different decisions. All of a sudden it opens up a whole new set of possibilities that you might not have considered on your own before. So again, for those of us who've been working in the kind of implications of measurement space, it's quite powerful because all of a sudden you can just have a wider range of possibilities. And for what only humans can do, I think listening is, and just the way that the storytelling approach almost allows you to kind of develop this cadence and kind of thoughtfulness around listening, around responding. I don't think we have AI technologies. We were talking earlier around, could we be replacing ourselves on this panel next year, for example, with avatar versus ourselves? I think that's possible, but probably not going to be as effective, right? To listen and to respond and to engage, particularly in kind of areas of work that are meaningful, that are about people's lives or about vulnerability, that's really hard, I think, to replicate. How do you decide what is worth measuring? I think is a human decision. You can't just outsource that because there's real implications and consequences to measurement. And then how do you navigate the power dynamics between different groups around the implications of measurement? So a lot of what is powerful around meaningful measurement, I think, is it forces a different kind of conversation around what are we learning? How do funders and partners and policymakers act differently as a result? And there's a different dynamic between those that are seeking capital and those that have capital, and how you have a conversation around impact. So I think that's a very human thing, and I don't really know if we can replace all of that with AI yet.
Thank you. And I guess to build on some of that thing around the human capacity and the kind of for me there's something kind of just uniquely human about meaning making, and there's such a big distinction between processing information and meaning making, and that feels like for me that is the thing that we really need to protect when it comes to ensuring that meaningful in and of itself is meaningful. And I guess thinking about storytelling and some of what you shared, I think in particular we see like meaning making being really significant in several places. So the first one being in the telling of the stories and the kind of that moment that you described, that having someone there who can listen, who can hold, who can guide that conversation, who can bear witness to somebody and make that space for them, and make it a meaningful space for them. That is something that can't really be replaced by AI, and risks, thinking back to kind of our the characteristics, it risks feeling more extractive if we stray into AI and taking on those sorts of roles. We see also like meaning in the stories themselves. So, arriving at these stories through this rich reflective process, we arrive at stories that are full of turns of phrase, full of metaphors, full of detail, full of the richness of human voice. And if we kind of, default to AI to kind of try and edit these stories, we may lose some of that texture, which is what makes them meaningful and impactful. And thirdly, the kind of discussion sessions are like the really big meaning making part, where we bring people together, across a breadth of different experiences to kind of sit down and discuss these stories and talk together about what we can learn from them. And that's what makes this method, that's where the kind of inclusion and the empowerment come in. This is kind of what means it's not kind of a plurality of voices are kind of sense making together in a room. And for me, that's where really rich meaning making happens. So I think, it's thinking about what is the role of AI in kind of protecting some of those spaces that feel really, really vital in enabling us to kind of really deeply measure things in ways that I think are retained. And I guess an example of this from a few years ago is that around the time of the pandemic, we used storytelling to evaluate the impact of Oxford's kind of response to COVID and how local authorities and other services responded to that and what we could learn from it. and we collected, a whole breadth of stories, one from a volunteer. And this volunteer spoke in the story about how she went to really extreme lengths around the city to try and find this very particular lettuce for a tortoise, for somebody who was isolating. And it seems like a really trivial thing, but this story, this phrase, lettuces for tortoises, at the time it became shorthand in the city council and amongst other partners for going the extra mile, showing up for somebody, really caring. And I think the reason that, it could have been brushed off as something quite insignificant, but the reason that it has endured and the reason it had impact was because of that process, that human process through which we'd arrived at the story, and then that human sense making where people came together and really deliberated and kind of brought about it together. So yeah, those are the things that I feel are most kind of key in terms of thinking about how do we preserve those things. And so I guess the question that we're asking or are thinking about in terms of the design of and how we might bring AI into our measurement is like, what role can it play in helping humans to do the things that they do best, basically, which is listening, participating, discussing, and sense making together.
Okay, great. Thank you, Nick. I want to go to you on this, and maybe I'll just push a little bit building on Sarah, what you said, because I agree with what both of you have said about sort of where AI can be helpful and where we need to be careful and what needs to be distinctly human. And I have colleagues who are doing essentially, they're not doing the storytelling meetings, but they're doing things like that with a bunch of different AIs, right? And they would say, it's like having a bunch of people in the room, right? And I get Perplexity and Claude and my ChatGPT. And so it does raise this question of how do we, if that's not what we want, right? How do we design the AIs in a way that fosters what we want and sets some guardrails and boundaries around that?
Yeah, so on that point, expanding into the challenges, I came across this thing on a podcast. You're not scared of AI. You're scared of what capitalism will do to AI. And that really changed how I was thinking about it, because it's basically what is the system within which this technology is being developed, and of all the possible forms it could take, of all the possible use cases, where is it going to end up doing? And so that's the bit that really worries me, because going back to my earlier statement, it definitely can play a meaningful role here, but I'm not sure that it eventually will, because of all of those other pressures that are on the technology, people using the technology and so on. I mean, we talked about the never-ending pressure on social impact organizations to be more efficient and achieve more with less budget and so on. And so that, in my mind, is probably going to lead to shortcuts and things like that. I will say we have built the investor council thing where we have a bunch of AI trying to spot things that our team hasn't spotted when we think about things. There's also a fund in our portfolio that their whole thing is on inclusivity. They have this concept of inclusive alpha, which is alpha is when you sort of generate more returns in the market, and that's coming from being more inclusive. And they use AI to catch the biases that they themselves would miss, even though they are extremely rigorous on catching biases. So I think, again, lots of ways that it can add value. It's just the system and context that it operates in. On the design principles, I think I echo a lot of what you guys said, so I'm not going to rehash it. I would maybe just abstract one thing to a principle level, and then maybe just comment on something else that I've bumped into a few times in practice. So I think the principle is, it's very tempting to sort of play with the technology and discover that it can do a cool thing, and then figure out where you're going to use the cool thing that it can do. And it's really not doing that. You don't want to do that. What you want to do is start with the outcome that you want to achieve, and then figure out how the technology can help you to do that. But that's hard because it needs at least 5 minutes of thinking, and we're often quite impatient and just want to do the cool thing with the new chatbot. So we're trying to be really disciplined on that, what is the outcome we're trying to achieve, and therefore how does AI contribute to that? One of the funds of our portfolio has a set of principles that they've established that will help them to make those decisions. And I'm now trying to take us on the journey of doing that as well, because I think that's just a good process to go through in terms of figuring out where you will and won't deploy AI. And the practical thing that I'll say is, in terms of design choices, is setting the bar for what you deploy into the real world. So, people often experiment with things, but then it takes on a life of its own when it actually gets deployed. And so the process that we've kind of landed on, and we're constantly tweaking it, is understand the system that you are trying to improve and what performance looks like for that system. Understand that deeply, and then see if AI can mirror or improve upon that performance. So we're asking it, can you do what the current system does? So, can you do it? Second one is, can you do it consistently? So, can you do it over time and in different scenarios and so on and so forth? And the third one is, can you do it fairly? So does the profile of that performance look equal across lots of different groups in lots of different contexts and so on? And that is the bar that we have for deploying something. So we think that that makes it fairly safe, that we're not going to end up with something that is so far away from where we wanted it to end up, such that we regret kind of deploying it. As I say, everyone's discovering on this journey. This is the process we have. It will probably evolve and iterate over time, but we're trying to think about our own gating items around what we will use AI for and not. So, I think that's probably one of the most important choices that we made.
Okay, thank you. I have many more questions, but I want to open it up to those of you here in the room and those of you joining online. And I'm going to turn to Jessica first, who's been keeping tabs on the chat, and ask you, Jessica, to just share some of the questions that folks joining online have put in there.
Okay, can you hear me? There's a lot of people online who have been very actively engaged. I'm going to read out 3 questions and take from them what you will. The first one I think is probably mainly for Nick, but not only. It's a bit of a wonky technical question. So, AI can open up black boxes in terms of understanding stakeholder lived experience, but replace it with another black box of an inscrutable LLM embedding model. So can you speak to how we can use AI so decisions about meaning, structure, and context are transparent in the analysis of large data collections? That makes sense? Replacing one black box with, I'll just put out the other ones and modify. I think this one's mostly for you, Sarah, but you might all have a response. So when working in a nonprofit environment, there's resource scarcity. How do you make the time for meaningful measurement with or without AI? And then for everyone, we're in a university, what are the learning gaps or research gaps that you want people to fill to help you do this work better?
Cool. I'll just start on the technical one. So this is known as sort of explainability in the field. So can you explain the thing that the machine has come up with in a way that makes sense? And that's obviously really important, not just for impact, but also investment decisions, people decisions, and so on. So we haven't really got to the level of sophistication of things where you lose sight of how a decision or thing has been made. So it's relatively easy for us to interrogate. The way that this typically happens is if you imagine like a hierarchy of agents, AI agents, and sort of something down here makes a decision which influences the things here's decision which influences, and so on and so forth. And then you just get the thing that popped out of the top agent. You have no idea of the sort of cascading choices that has been made to lead to that decision. So yeah, we're not there yet. We're not there yet. So I can sort of dodge the question, but I think that there's 2 things. One is when we've started designing our agents, we probably over-design them. We give them so much context about what's important to us and what's not important to us and so on, such that we have more confidence that it will behave in a way that is true to how we would behave. So I think that's really important. So a lot of people just run an evaluation and say, we wanted the number 4, did it give us the number 4, and so on. Whereas we're saying, what other number could it have given us, and why didn't it give us that number? And did it sort of follow a thinking process that feels like our thinking process, and so on. So that's the first one. And then the second one is, again, building that into the design, right? So for example, we have these automated workflows that a user does something and it spits out another thing at the end. All of the kind of thinking, which is when you click on the thing and it opens up this box and you can kind of see the machine thinking and talking to itself. We save that. We don't pass that to the user, but we save all of that. So we can go back and check all of the reasoning that it was doing in terms of making a decision. So that's a little bit the technical question, but I think this is going to be a big thing as these systems get more and more complicated. In terms of just on the last one, so it doesn't have to come back to me, in terms of research gaps, the rate at which questions are generated about what does the technology do, how do we use it effectively, and so on, is so fast. I don't even know how to begin to answer before I've answered the first question of the day, there's like 10 more questions. And so if someone has a good way of solving that problem, that would be great, because it's just so hard to keep up with the developments in this space and all of the nuance around how you should use it and so on and so forth. But Yeah, it sort of depends on the day, basically. Is the question.
Great. Maybe I'll pick up on the learning and research gaps one. So I think I'm pretty excited about the prospects, particularly around efficiency gains and some of the things I talked about. Assuming we're saving time and effort and kind of mental bandwidth, are we actually deploying that in other ways that matter? And that I think is still an open question. So for example, if you now spend less time on data analysis, but you need more time on the interpretation, on discussion, on engaging with people who are affected by measurement, do you make that time, do you spend your time and your budgets accordingly? And does that change the way you do the work? Does that also change the way you measure it? Does that change the way you select the priorities for what gets valued or not? I don't think we know that yet. So for me, this is one of those pieces. And I think there's the term, is it cognitive offloading? Is that the right term?
Yeah.
Which is we're taking a bunch of stuff that used to be hard, or at least we are outsourcing part of our thinking to machines, as it were. Does that make you less critical, less thoughtful? Do you skip a couple of steps? What kind of implication does that have on how you design your measurement approaches, how you look at data, what kinds of things you might elevate or miss? I don't think, again, we know fully what that looks like, but we know that some of it's not good. There's been some comparisons around what cognitive offloading is doing to various types of students. For example, we will not name universities and studies and all of that. It certainly doesn't happen here, right? So, but I think that the whole idea of being critical, being thoughtful, and being optimistic at the same time is a really important skill that we have to cultivate. And Mariah, I think this relates to some of your work around not just either one of those things, but how do you hold all of those paradoxes in some ways together in the work, that you can have efficiency gains. It forces you to be more critical. You can possibly make more time for the things that matter. And there's a whole bunch of risks if you do that. I think that is kind of where we find ourselves now. And so I think depending on maybe the day or the kind of conversation, you can be on either side of that. Oh, this is a great thing. This is going to be really terrible. But I think ultimately you have to kind of revert to a mean somewhere where it says, like, what parts is it good for? Am I getting better at the things that I need to spend more time on? And what are the ways in which we instill a kind of skill around judgment? A lot of what we teach, for example, next week in our impact measurement courses, impact measurement has a lot of frameworks, standards, tools, data. Ultimately, it still comes down to judgment. So what are the skills that we're teaching around judgment? And how does AI support that rather than cognitive offloading diminish some of what we think is important for this kind of work?
And I can pick up on that question around meaningful measurement against kind of, the realities of the day-to-day and the issues around resource and capacity, which is such a real thing, and one that we definitely feel at the All Fire Station. And we're somewhere that talks about this stuff all the time and get funded to do it. We still find it hard to kind of make that space. I'd say that there's definitely, it doesn't mean necessarily you need to kind of completely kind of transform everything you do, but think about, where could you pick a place and start? And that could be as simple as like looking at the existing work you do. Like, are there questions there that you don't, do you need to ask all of the questions you're asking and the forms that you're asking people to complete? What's a nice to have, what's a need to know? How could you kind of concentrate on what you need to learn so you're collecting data that you therefore can meaningfully make space to engage with as part of your team? I'd also say, very much the constraints around this are because of dynamics with funders. Do you have funders who you could have a conversation with around your reporting if there are barriers there that are meaning you're reporting on things that you feel are meaningless? Can you kind of push back on some of that? Is there a way to suggest an alternative? So whether you do see a kind of a sympathetic funder, it's often worth having that conversation, because in our experience we find people are kind of often really receptive to this stuff and are also banging their heads against the wall sometimes, looking for alternatives and interested in people that want to kind of develop that further. So definitely speaking to funders, I think thinking of measurement as being the work, so that thing around embedding it in your organization, make it part of your culture, finding methods that are not just the kind of thing you have to do at the end for the reporting requirements, but are part of your learning. And I think if you can find like what that is for you, and it might be storytelling, but it could well be something else, I think that's a really important way of kind of trying to build it in, so it's not an extra, but it just is what you're doing, and that helps you to make space for it. And certainly for us, that's what helps us to prioritize it. I think build it into your funding proposals in the same spirit as well. You know, it is the work. And yeah, I think I think the other thing to add is that this work is it's not siloed. You know, it's very much part of a wider systemic issue around it being challenging to measure in these meaningful ways. Otherwise, we would all just be measuring in meaningful ways all the time. And I think there's a part to play for funders in thinking about how can they enable non-profits, charities to be measuring in meaningful ways, and examples being kind of initiating some of those dialogues, with grantees and speaking to them about, we understand that, there are outcomes that funders need, but what are the outcomes of the partners? How could those align? What works for everybody? And also kind of incentivizing learning, funding learning, encouraging, so in some cases funders saying like, that being the output, tell us what you've learned, report on that. And that again, it helps partners justify making the time and space to do things in more meaningful ways.
Okay, thank you. Just a reflection, and then we'll open it up, and Jessica will come around with the microphone for those of you who have questions. But the thing that struck me the most as we did the research that underpinned the playbook and learn more about what you were doing at the old fire station was the bit that you talked about as sort of taking the risk of talking to the funders, and that it took so much courage, of course, to do that, right? Because you're not being asked to give them stories, you're being asked to give them KPIs or whatever it is. And yet it opens things up tremendously, right? And I remember one of your colleagues talking about how there was almost this sense of relief from the funders that you started talking to that, oh, now they had permission to think about this as well, because you had the courage and taken the risk to sort of offer up this possibility. It really became a transformative conversation. And I think we often don't imagine sort of powerfully enough what could be possible or have the courage to do it. But really, there are many people in this system who want the kind of meaningful measurement work that sits at the heart of this approach. Okay, questions from those of you here in the room?
Hi, my name is Julia, and thank you very much for this amazing conversation. I have two questions, one a general one for all of you, and then the second one a bit more technical for whoever wants to answer it. And so the first one would be, I keep hearing meaningful and impactful measurement used interchangeably. What is, in your opinion, the difference? Does it meaningful measurement, does it mean it's automatically impactful, or does impactful measurement mean that it is meaningful measurement, right? So how that interplay actually, how do you see it in your own perspective? And then the second one would be, and correct me if I'm wrong, the way I understood it was that, so the use of AI is helping us more in the technicality of the data when we deal with the data. It makes it maybe even more faster, doing the analysis and all of that. And then when it comes to the sense making or the judgment, it's us humans. That's something that we do, and that AI cannot do it. But I would want to challenge that a little bit. So for example, if I take an agent, if I train it based on my own critical thinking, and suddenly it's now thinking the way couldn't the AI agent now actually kind of critically come up and make sense making and judge the way I wanted to judge? Do you see this as an advantage? Do you see this as something that's going to come in the future, or is it something like more that you're skeptical? Yeah, thank you so much, and sorry for the long question.
Who wants to start on this question of meaningful and impactful and how we're using those terms?
Yeah, I think meaningful measurement in this context is referring back to the principles from the playbook. The idea is that if you bring those in, it can be more impactful, but there's a relationship kind of between them. But maybe, you both can clarify that. I mean, I think impactful is such a loaded term, and what meaningful is an attempt to be a bit more specific around what that means. Maybe on your second question, though, which is a very interesting one, I think the sense-making part, for example, today, probably can't be fully offloaded to an agent. However, having tried some of that, it is equally impressive and problematic. So in the not too distant future, that is going to happen, whether we like it or not. So I think today's picture is essentially a lot of the easy stuff you can hand over with demonstrable efficiency gains. And I think you can put some guardrails around the risks. And it's not, the implications, positive or negative, might be somewhat limited, right? So in terms of like what could go wrong in this kind of area. I think once you get into sense making, judgment, etc., conversational, all of a sudden it becomes a lot more trickier. I would say, for example, a lot of the uses of AI in self-help, mental well-being, therapy, those kinds of, this is where it's coming up front and center. Almost like our conversation on measurement and sense making is a few steps behind that. So there's obviously ethical challenges, there's process challenges. Practically speaking, though, you can do a lot of good sense making with AI today. And with the neural models in particular, not only are there less hallucinations, you can go back to source data, you can begin to triangulate in different ways. So I would say that the future you described also is already here. Is it reliable? Probably in some cases, other cases not. Is it worth testing? For sure. Is that the frontier kind of case that we should be kind of building on? Maybe or maybe not. Like this is, in some ways, it's a very live conversation. I mean, we're going to have this conversation next week, almost in terms of the uses and kind of misuses of AI and impact measurement. And I think at least some of the misuses are when you move from here's all the analysis and here's what I'm going to do about it. There's still a gap where I think you need humans to say, and this is what it means for my organization, this is what it means for my population, this is what it means for my future, for the governance of this organization. I don't think even with larger context windows, you can bring all of that in. But I think that we're going to get much better even in 6 months around what you're saying. Like there'll be agents doing sense making and get us much further along on that curve. And so then the question still becomes, well, if we have extra time in theory, what will we do with that? And I think that's a really interesting question.
I guess I would just add something around. I guess for me, it feels like there's a slight risk around echo chambers as well, in terms of training somebody who very much mirrors your way of thinking. And actually, I think really, like, I know that sense making can take many forms, but I think the richest sense making is when you have people who bring this plurality of perspectives. And I think even thinking about plurality within AI, it does veer towards certain worldviews. So I do think there's something really important about some of that kind of what Karim touched on before, that kind of human role in kind of curating perspectives that reflect those different things and not becoming too absorbed in our own playing back to ourselves. I think it's probably can be really interesting to see what patterns emerge, but yeah, and I think the second thing is there's something in all of this around like measurement being enjoyable and fun, and I think it feels a lot more, there's something about being in a room on your own with a computer that maybe has its limits, and I think measurement and sense making that we retain, and I think meaning residing not in the data but very often most impactfully in us, in the ways that we retain it and bring it to other spaces. It's done in ways that are like enjoyable and stimulating, engaging through people and those human experiences. So I just wonder about some of the trade-offs, and if we go down this route of lots of agents rather than lots of people, basically.
Okay, let's collect a few, maybe 2 or 3 more questions together, and then we'll have a final round of responses, and then we can stay and discuss further during the reception.
Good afternoon. So I'm Dr. Manuel Lee from the UBS Oxford Centre for Applied AI. Nice to meet you all today. A very interesting discussion. I want to ask a question about how to measure the measurement. The same data can have different versions of stories. And as humans, we have very different hopes, beliefs, desires, and value systems. And I guess when we talk about meaningful measurement, it involves a lot of ethical issues, belief systems, categorizations. And I wonder which stories or which kind of measurement will eventually have more say, and which kind of agents or subjects of measurements would take more responsibility. Are they stakeholder oriented? Would it be consumer oriented? Would it be corporate oriented? Whether we need to take the level of measurement impact to legislation or more a prescriptive kind of training for the entire corporate world to build another kind of education for the staff members. So how to measure measurements itself? Thank you.
Hi, thanks so much, everyone. That was a really fascinating discussion. My name is Jenny Richmond. I'm an independent consultant, and I'm interested in the sort of knock-on systems impact that you guys identify from your different perspectives in the social and environmental impact sector. So, how do you see the sort of meaningful measurement and the use of AI within that and that rapidly changing environment that you've described really well? How do you see that having sort of a play out in terms of the system or the sector of social and environmental change? Are there any observations that you could share with us there? Thanks.
Take one more.
Thank you very much. Very fascinating talk. And I noticed that you like mentioned the storytelling, especially. So I was wondering whether are there any concerns about using AI while targeting the storytelling, because there has been some debate or some controversial ideas about treating AI as a like emotional outlet, or like pouring out our true feelings to an AI, or like trying to quantify it into a data or something. So how do we balance it? Thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. Let's just have some very quick responses. I know these are not quick questions to be answered, and then we'll continue the discussion during the reception. So we have the question about measuring measurement, right, or assessing measurement, about how AI and meaningful measurement might play out across the social impact sector, and then this question about sort of the challenges of using AI around storytelling, given the sort of challenges we've seen around AI as an emotional outlet, or perhaps not the best outlet for our emotions.
Can I have a go? Yeah. This is why I love Oxford. These questions. I'll pick up the measurement one, because that's kind of what you have to do when you design an agent. You sort of think about, I'm going to give you a way to measure something, and then I have to evaluate, i.e. measure your ability to measure the thing that I asked you to measure. So I'll give you an example. So we are a multi-asset investor. So we do stuff that ends up in charities, social enterprises, and also for-profit companies that have a kind of social purpose. The first two, we're not too worried about like mission drift and greenwashing and whatever. It's baked into the very core of the organization. With for-profit companies that have a mission, we do get a little bit nervous about that. And we also try to say, what is the appropriate amount of impact that an organization needs to have for us to call it a kind of impact organization for us? So we used to have 3 slides in a deck that is explained this concept, like our threshold for what counts as an impact startup. And the team more or less got it, right? Like we disagree a little bit, but we kind of got it. When we tried to get an agent to classify things, it was a disaster, okay? And we ended up writing 12 pages of context in order for the thing to match the performance of our team when classifying things. And so it speaks a little bit to the question before on like sense making. I try not to go to, can AI sense make, or can it think, or whatever. It's more like, can it behave in the way you want it to get it to behave, and how much context does it need? So we end up basically evaluating the quality of the instruction that we give it, the guidance that we give it, in order to figure out whether it can measure the thing properly or not. So I'm there testing these 12 pages of rules with our impact team to say, is this how we want the thing to process information to make that judgment? And then when we think that's a good idea, we go and deploy it across our portfolio, that we have a good understanding of whether it's impactful or not. And then we say, okay, you've got a bunch of these classifications wrong. We've got to go back to the drawing board and change some of the rules and so on, and then release it. I was very frustrated that we deployed it, and then 2 months later, the team came back and said, oh, we want to add some more rules to the thing, which basically meant we had to do this entire evaluation process again. But that's the other thing, right? That it's not static. It keeps changing in response to what is happening in the world, because our threshold moved. Something that's related that we talked about before as well is it doesn't have to be the AI or the human doing the sense making or the decision making and so on. So we have this annual exercise where we try to think about impact across our portfolio. And we were trying to get AI to help us to do this because it's a really heavy task to do. And one of the things that's very important to us, particularly in that for-profit segment of our portfolio, is the affordability of the products and services that they create, right? Because that determines who can access it. And essentially, what we were getting back from the AI was very mixed in terms of how we thought it was thinking about affordability. And it didn't say this, but essentially, what it was saying is you haven't defined whether you mean relative affordability or absolute affordability. So, relative affordability is this thing is cheaper than that thing, therefore, this is affordable. And absolute affordability is this thing costs $20, therefore, it's affordable. And when I sort of realized that, I went to our impact team and I was like, guys, do we have a way of thinking about this? And they were like, no, we've never really thought about it at that level of detail of what do we actually mean when we say affordability. So then all the senior stakeholders of the organization had to get together to think about what do we mean when we say affordability. And in classic BSC fashion, we concluded it means both. We need to have both in order for this thing to count. But anyway, it's just an example to show how using AI can actually sharpen your own thinking about like how do you define things, how do you measure things, what is important for you, and so on. And so I often see this process as adding value to both sides. We can make the machine better, but we can also make the humans better in our job. So yeah.
I'll just build on what Nick said on two of the questions about measuring kind of measurement and then the systems impact question. I think it's been interesting to experiment with different personas in AI. So again, whenever you are thinking about, you collected some data, qualitative, quantitative, you're trying to think about what it means. Often there are different people who are collecting information or doing the measurement versus those that are most affected by measurement versus those who are actually deciding or allocating. You can at least provide context and begin to adopt those personas and think about how different parties would actually understand or explain what it is that they are optimizing for, what's most important to them, how they would look at certain kinds of information, and then interestingly, what biases may exist in certain kinds of responses. So if you actually have a conversation, and I've done this both with myself as well as other colleagues, you just look at responses and say, well, what was the interpretation or what are three different interpretations of this response? You know, if someone says, hey, this is a great number, we exceeded our targets. You know, what does that really imply around follow-on kind of decisions or investments? And could different people on a team or different people in the capital chain take the same numbers or same results and actually have a very different interpretation? And sometimes where are they deluding themselves? So where do they have a behavioral bias around taking something and interpreting it in a way where the bias is very explicit? So for example, we see this a lot with negative impact. So if you miss a target, if you miss a target, is that good or bad? Well, it depends on how the target was set. If it's an impact target, it's not a, we didn't make enough money kind of question. It's somebody's life possibly is affected because you didn't achieve a target if that target was set by the community around how much access to water they were looking for in that year. It's a very real thing. But how does a stakeholder, let's say at the top of the chain, on the kind of asset owner side, interpret that? They might just say, well, you missed a target, but that wasn't as relevant as something else. So all of a sudden you have a bias there around certain kinds of information or certain kinds of decision implications. You can play that out and model it out before you actually do your annual reporting. And I think that's been really powerful because all of a sudden the ability to do scenario kind of planning, to be able to use different forms of data and then to almost adopt personas and responses has made all of our work around analysis and decision making much more powerful. And also for ourselves. I know for me, every time I'm now running analyses, I have a list of biases that I know I'm probably susceptible to, and many of us are. You can run some of your analyses through that. It's not perfect by any means, but I think it's much better than not having done some of that. So I'm pretty optimistic about the ability to catch some of those issues earlier on, to be able to, I think, just like pay more attention to the consequences of measurement. Because a lot of time we just assume, forget the right answer, measure the right things will happen after. Real life doesn't really work that way. You have to spend a lot of time thinking about modeling what happens after. And I think that's been a relatively new kind of use case for me. So I think on that measuring, the measurers, in some ways it determines like whose value set is informing the decisions. And can you predict that more in advance as opposed to just waiting till later?
Thank you. Perhaps I'll pick up on that third question around storytelling and story collecting. And I guess, something I would say is it's something we haven't experimented with using it with AI, but I think we do, you know, our story collectors are people who reflect a breadth of different perspectives, and that are fundamentally people that we feel are relatable to the people that are telling their stories. So I think there's something really important about who's listening to you, who's bearing witness, who can help you to relax, that are very human and really important in helping somebody, particularly somebody who very often people will say, I haven't got a story to tell, I've nothing to say. People who maybe need that, someone to help hold that space for them. And I think there is something around, you know, sometimes these stories do take directions where people are sharing a lot and can find themselves, you know, things come up, it can be emotional. There's someone who is holding that safeguarding responsibility in the room, and who is kind of like caring and making sure you're okay. That feels really important, and feels like if you're asking people to go to depth and to share their experiences and the impact of what it's meant for them, sometimes raising things that are challenging, I think you have a responsibility to make sure that that's held in a way that feels kind of responsible and respectful and meaningful for the person who's telling their story. So there are other reasons I think why it would remain human, and I think your point around some of the concerns around it kind of becoming an emotional outlet and things are probably very real things to think about if people were considering taking it down that avenue.
Okay, thank you so much. I know there's a lot more to discuss, and so I hope those of you here in the room will stay and join us for a reception. But first, okay, thank you so much. I know there's a lot more to discuss, and so I hope those of you here in the room will stay and join us for a reception. But first, please join me in thanking our panelists, Sarah, Karim, and Nick. Thank you so much.